So thank you, Dr. Sabatini, for joining us with the GCSP today.
Thanks, Ashley.
Pleasure to have you. So Dr. Christopher Sabatini is a Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, US, and Americas program at Chatham House. Formerly a lecturer in discipline in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Chris is also on the advisory board of Harvard University's LASPA and of the Inter-American Foundation. His areas of expertise include democracy, human rights, foreign policy in the region, social inclusion, resource extraction, and community rights, Venezuela and Cuba. Chris, thank you so much for joining us here today. My first question to you is, what is the current security relationship between the US and Latin America?
Well, the security relationship has always been driven largely by US concerns. There's a famous international relations theorist who coined the term intermestic to refer to international and domestic issues. And the US's relations with Latin America, not just in security, but primarily in security, have been driven by these domestic issues. And currently it is drugs, primarily, and narcotics, corruption, and crime. And that has meant oftentimes providing assistance to the armed forces and to the national police in combating issues of drug trafficking, illicit markets, human trafficking, and the like. And then increasingly also, perhaps unfortunately, given the tone of this discussion in terms of also immigration, is working with Mexicans and Central American authorities in particular in returning immigrants, which has involved what are referred to as our immigrations and customs enforcement authorities, which is effectively a police force, a border police force, in returning them. So what we're seeing right now are US collaboration on issues of narcotics, corruption, and narcotics trafficking in Mexico and Central America, less so in Brazil, to a certain extent also in Colombia and Peru. And then there's also the issue of Venezuela, which has become an increasing security concern for the United States. That does not involve, obviously, military assistance to Venezuela or to any of its neighboring countries. That really is recently involved the issue of handing down a series of indictments for high-level Venezuelan officials and members of the armed forces and the police forces concerning their allegations of involvement in narcotics trafficking and arms sales. So that's been a security concern for the United States as well, which will only grow as Venezuela becomes more and more fragile and the possibility of collapse looms even greater. The risk that Venezuela will become, if you will, a failed state within the region grows more and more.
There has been a recent upsurge in protests in Venezuela and a lot of other countries in the Latin America region. Why is that? What can be done? And will human rights and democracy be achieved?
Wow, those are big questions. Okay, let's start with the social protests. The reasons vary. We've seen them break out in Haiti. We've seen them break out in Honduras, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, and Venezuela. And the reasons are diverse. It's difficult to lump them all together. So let me just try, with the risk of some overgeneralization, to group some of them, but be careful in painting a broad brushstroke on this. The first of all is the case of Chile and Colombia in particular. What we see there is a rise of demands over social justice, social inclusion, access to public services, and improvement in public services. The reason was often labeled as being inequality, but that really doesn't explain it because these have been largely unequal societies for a long time, historically even. So why now? And the question is really about rising relative insecurity, rising inequality, as well as perceptions about inequality, as well as a relative level of prosperity that have allowed citizens to be able to make these demands. In Chile, it's demands for better education, better health care, including also better representation in the political system that have become somewhat ossified. The same thing in Colombia, but also in Colombia, it's the case too, where the peaceful process, where 20 years ago, Colombia was on the brink of a failed state, has allowed these demands to be able to percolate to the top and to be expressed in a peaceful way. Honduras is a different case, where that is about concerns over the elections and complaints over the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and sort of also his meeting with demands with force. In Haiti, it's over demands over the polarized system and the breakdown of the political system, as well as concerns over corruption, in particular, Venezuelan oil largesse that seems to have been misspent. In the case of Bolivia and Venezuela, there are different reasons. They have to do with democratic rights. In the case of Venezuela, we now, as of January 23rd, have the unusual situation, January 23rd, 2019, of the unusual situation of two presidents. Juan Guaido, who is nominated by the National Assembly as a constitutional president, interim president, and been recognized by almost 60 countries worldwide. And then Nicolas Maduro, the man who was elected in 2018 under very controversial and probably fraudulent elections. Guaido has tried to bring his supporters to the streets over and over again to demand free and fair elections, to demand human rights, and that's been met with repression by the Maduro government, which is, despite all anticipation, has actually managed to cling to power. And despite an incredibly collapsing economy, the likes of which the world has not seen in any country that hasn't been at war. In the case of Bolivia, those protests erupted on two sides. First, it was the allegations of a stolen election by then President Evo Morales, who was running for a questionable fourth term, and questions that were raised by credible international election observers that led eventually to his ouster, arguably in a coup by the military. And now you're seeing protests by his supporters against an interim government that has cracked down very violently against his supporters. And most recently, using COVID-19 quarantine measures as an excuse to crack down on Morales's supporters and try to round them up and purge, if you will, society and the government from its supporters. So again, questions why? Corruption, stolen elections, human rights, as well as in the case of Chile and Colombia, a rising level of prosperity and citizens, I think, healthy demands for more responsive, more accountable, and more effective social programs.
Thanks a lot. There seems to be a polarization happening in the leadership in several countries, where, as you've mentioned, the disdain for checks and balances, and what is happening in the leadership side of things amongst different officials across the region.
Well, the polarization, it really is sort of the key to understanding a lot of this. And the reasons stem from a number of issues. First of all is growing citizen distrust in their political leadership that we're seeing in surveys across the board. A number I like to cite is, according to Vanderbilt University in the United States, surveys called Latin American Public Opinion polls. More than 80% of Latin American citizens believe that half or more of their politicians are corrupt. That means that people simply don't trust the political system and are willing to sort of engage in support for populist outsider candidates or other candidates in very much a polarized relationship that sort of, in which sort of corruption has become the de facto sort of cleavage within these societies, in which there's no sort of in between. Nobody's for corruption. It's always a question of who's less corrupt than the other, who's more self-righteous than the other. And that does lead to a level of polarization that we're seeing in places like Mexico or Brazil, Colombia as well, in which that's very, very difficult to define. And the problem is this, along with this lack of trust in the political class has been a collapse of political parties. So we've seen massive amounts of electoral volatility, even in places like Colombia, but also obviously in places like Peru, which has effectively not had a party system since 1990, but in Brazil as well. And even in cases like Chile, where levels of political support of political parties has been the lowest in all the hemisphere. And so in these cases, what it means is that raises the risk of the rise of populist candidates who claim to speak on behalf of the popular will and who come from the outside and sort of don't have the sort of training or background or trajectory, and even arguably the disposition to be able to support democratic checks and balances and sort of bring the country together. We see this in Brazil with President Jair Bolsonaro. We see this in Mexico with President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And we see this with the rise of other candidates, including in El Salvador, for example, with Nayib Bukele, who came to power as an outsider candidate and has really stoked these divisions in a way that risks even further polarization and developing some sort of consensus to lead these countries forward.
They've all had different approaches as we've entered the coronavirus crisis globally. How do you foresee the geopolitical shifts? I guess you can see it already happening now, but in the region specifically, what's coming?
Well, COVID-19 has really thrown, I think, a sharp light on what were trends that were already evident in the region. First of all, on the one hand, the economies in these regions were already cooling down. They had started to cool down in 2013, 2014. That has become even faster. They were bumping along at growth rates, taking out Venezuela, which has seen its economy decrease or contract by 2/3. Taking that out, most economies were bumping along at 1 or 2% growth. Some cases, Peru, for example, maybe 5% growth. But that wasn't going to be sufficient at any rate to bring in new entrants to the labor markets and to address issues of socioeconomic development. Now, because of COVID and because of the shutdown, we're looking at as much as 6% contraction in the case of Mexico, and stagnating or negative growth throughout the hemisphere. So already, these middle-income countries are sort of at risk of seeing their middle classes fall through the cracks and grow even more unequal. The second effect that COVID-19 has had, in the overlay of this populism that I talked about, is we're seeing really divergent responses to COVID-19. The populist governments in Brazil, Nicaragua, and Mexico that I mentioned are really ignoring the warning signs of COVID-19. In those cases, the presidents have urged their people to get out the streets. They have not enforced any element of at a federal level, stay-at-home measures or self-containment measures. In the case of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro has mocked COVID-19 as being a hoax or being nothing more than a measly cold. In Mexico, the President AMLO has said that he carries lucky charms that protect him from infection by COVID-19. What that means is these countries are very susceptible to rising infection rates. But it also demonstrates, I think, a profound lack of respect for science and technology and expertise that was fundamentally lacking and will really sort of indicates a real long haul for these governments to be able to overcome effective dysfunction that we're seeing today. On the other hand, you're seeing other countries such as Peru or Argentina, Colombia, some of them surprising, like Argentina, implementing very, very strict stay-at-home policies. And in those cases, unlike the populists that I mentioned, we're seeing those presidents' popularity increase, in some cases dramatically, well over a majority of the population supporting them, the individual presidents, and their policies. So in those cases, we're seeing, I think, a rebound that may actually, in the end, be to the benefit against the level of populism that I talked about. But also we're seeing, and at this point, we're seeing in the case of El Salvador, is a real risk to the checks and balances. The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who in mid-March implemented a very strict lockdown and travel bans in the country, now has used COVID-19 as an excuse to enforce his quarantine at gunpoint by the armed forces, rounding up over several hundred political prisoners, and has ignored the warnings of the Supreme Court to roll back those policies and not to enforce and not to engage in human rights abuses. So it's going to be a mixed bag. I think the larger issue we need to focus on here are the economic effects overlaid over already alarming levels of disaffection and polarization.
My last question to you is is one that I like to ask to people who are very familiar with the regions that they're talking about, and it's what can help us understand the region better? What the outside world, those who are not so familiar, is there anything misunderstood about the region that we need to understand that's important to know?
There was a famous New York Times journalist, Scott Reston, who said about Americans that Americans will do everything for the region, meaning Latin America, except read about it and understand it. And that implies obviously intervening, peddling bad opinions, and doing all sorts of other things. So the first thing I think is follow it and understand it in its diversity. And this is not the fault necessarily only of the outside world. Latin Americans love to talk about their solidarity, their commonalities. The truth is they're a very diverse region with a lot of tensions that are playing out not just historically, but are playing out now when we see, for example, in the case of Venezuela, 1.5 million Venezuelans have fled the country, the economic and humanitarian disaster, and taken up residence in Colombia. That's out of a total of nearly 5 million Venezuelans that have left. And for the first time, we're seeing really nationalistic, even xenophobic reactions against those Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. So understanding that there are tensions within this hemisphere, also understanding that when people talk about a hemisphere that is governed by elected governments, with the exception of Cuba, but even within sort of the broad definition of democracy, there's a lot of variation. You have really the authoritarian and even failed states of Venezuela and Haiti, despite the nominal elections that they've had. You have functioning liberal democracies like Chile, Mexico, Argentina, and even Peru. But in those cases too, there are still structural weaknesses that are something to very much keep an eye on. And then of course, there's the issue of crime and insecurity across the region. And people like to say that it's a region that's not at war, that hasn't seen a border conflict that erupted in violence since 1995. There's several problems with that. The first of all is its internal security. Levels of crime and violence and murders in places like Honduras, Venezuela, and parts of Brazil actually equal war zones. So these are countries that are at war, primarily because of weak states and primarily because of the rise in crime and illicit markets and the inability of these states to govern these ungoverned areas. And so it's also important to recognize that this is a region that seems peaceful on the surface, but has levels of violence and crime that do approach wartime areas. And with that, as we're seeing in Venezuela, levels of refugees. Right now, we're looking at, there are more Venezuelan refugees than there are Rohingya who were forced out of Myanmar. And the levels of refugees from Venezuela too are approaching Syrian refugees as a result of that civil war. So again, it seems peaceful, but there are a whole series of undercurrents that are very, very troubling and are challenging human rights and humanitarian conditions.
Chris, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and teaching us more about the region. And we will be sure to read more and be more in tune and not just take it at face value. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Ashley. I appreciate it.
Thank you.